Carrying on with the second lesson of theme 4 about World War I, that's a lesson in which I examine the concept of a total war, which means a war in which the entire society is involved. And we're still in part 1 about the mobilization of societies. After, in part A, analyzing the active role played by civilians and how it was encouraged by government action, which was increasing. In part B, I will examine more specifically the impact that the government policies for winning the war had on societies, wondering if this period was a period of change and if that change was mostly or positive or not. So the first point will be to highlight how the period of the war, even for those who were not sent on the front line, was a period of hard times. And first of all, we'll talk about politics, because what is quite sure is that in France and Britain, one of the political impacts of the war was the reduction of democracy and civil liberties. But that reduction of democracy was largely accepted by the people, which ends up in the fact that a period of big crisis, like a war, are periods which are dangerous for democracy. In France, what is absolutely striking is the fact that on the eve of the declaration of war, one of the French politicians, one of the most popular ones, which had fought for peace, for preserving peace as much as possible before the war, the socialist deputy Jean Jaurès, was assassinated. And precisely, he was assassinated by a man who was a right-wing nationalist, who blamed Jaurès for working on that peace and not being more aggressive to the Germans. So that assassination was a very big political event, and it marked probably the end of a period where opposition to war could be a respectable stance, respectable for the society of the time. Because in fact, a couple of days later, when the war had just started, so the funerals of Jean Jaurès were organized in Paris, and they were massively attended. But politically, what is interesting is that all the French political parties were present at the funeral of Jean Jaurès, even the far right, even the people who used to hate him. Because the funeral of Jean Jaurès were seen as a moment of celebration of national unity, at the moment when the nation was about to fight against the German enemy. And on this occasion, there was a unofficial but genuine agreement that political divisions had to be left behind for the duration of the war. And that moment in the history of French democracy was immediately named by the president of the Republic, l'Union Sacrée, the Sacred Union. Promoting national unity called for a limitation of political divisions, but it might also mean a limitation of political debates as well. And in this text, which is an excerpt from a speech pronounced at the funeral of Jaurès by Léon Jouot, who was another left-wing politician, is extremely interesting and kind of moving. Jaurès a été notre réconfort dans notre action passionnée pour la paix. Ce n'est pas sa faute ni la nôtre si la paix n'a pas triomphé. Avant d'aller vers le grand massacre, au nom des travailleurs qui sont partis, au nom de ceux qui vont partir, dont je suis, je crie devant ce cercueil toute notre haine de l'impérialisme et du militarisme sauvage qui déchaîne l'horrible crime. Cette guerre, nous ne l'avons pas voulue. Ceux qui l'ont déchaînée, despotes aux visées sanguinaires, aux rêves d'hégémonie criminelle, devront en payer le châtiment. Acculés à la lutte, nous nous levons pour repousser l'envahisseur, pour sauvegarder le patrimoine de la civilisation et d'idéologie généreuse que nous a légué l'histoire. Nous ne voulons pas que sombrent les quelques libertés si péniblement arrachées aux forces mauvaises. Notre volonté fut toujours d'agrandir les droits populaires, d'élargir le champ des libertés. C'est en harmonie avec cette volonté que nous répondons présent à l'ordre de mobilisation. What is very interesting with this text is that it's a good illustration of how a very left-wing man, a socialist, who does not believe that the opposition between nations is something more important than the struggle of the working class against the bourgeoisie. Well, that kind of man in the summer of 1914 was ready and convinced that this war against the Germans had to be fought, and that for the moment national unity was necessary, because for a left-wing man, well, fighting for France also meant fighting for democracy against an authoritarian regime like the German one. And so when Jaurès was buried after he died, it was as if the French political community was burying peace, and it opened up a period of war. That would change politics deeply. And if we cross the channel to Britain, there is kind of an equivalent of this opening moment which changed all the rules in politics. It was a law passed very swiftly, very easily in Parliament in August 1914, which was known as the Defense of the Realm Act, or DORA, the acronym. And I insist on the fact that it was passed very swiftly because, in fact, the new rules set by DORA strictly limited the rights of men in Britain, and in particular people's liberty, in order to focus only on waging the war and winning it. And so DORA gave an unprecedented power for the government to intervene in people's life. Censorship was very strict. In Britain, for example, discussing military matters in public was totally forbidden, and the press was heavily censored in almost all countries that were engaged in the war. In Britain, again, that's only an example, a curfew was imposed, and severe restrictions of movement of the people as well. Because the fear of spies and traitors was very high, in Britain, very strict limitations on non-British born citizens, and in particular those of German origins, were extremely important. In Britain, only 32,000 German inhabitants were put in internment camps or expatriated for the duration of the war. From a general point of view, in all countries at war, negative impacts on standards of living were real. That's of course only a detail, but in Britain the opening time of pubs was reduced, as well as the strength of drinks, because civilians had to be productive, and so alcoholic drinks were forbidden in the front, but also because they were sent they were forbidden at home, but they were sent on the front. Alcoholic drinks were more useful on the front because it was part of the strategy organized to have the soldiers holding on in the trenches. But you see, some shortages had to be imposed on the civilians in order to sustain the war effort. And so those rationing, I've already examined them in the past, but rationing was a way to limit everyone's consumption in order to prevent shortages. And so scenes like this one in France of women queuing for some food became a daily common scene in most of the countries of Europe who were fighting the war. Shortages were more important in some countries than others, and it's clearly Russia and Germany where shortages went so bad that a famine happened in Germany in the winter of 1916 due to the naval blockade. And we already saw how the huge economic crisis in Russia triggered the revolution of 1917. Everywhere, in parallel to the rationing system, a black market of basic products developed, which means an informal economy where the people that could afford it could still find some specific products, but at a very expensive price. And in fact, after 1916, inflation became important in most countries. Recall that inflation means that the price of items increases, which means that the value of the money is decreasing at the same time. So all societies were organized around the idea of preserving the highest level of unity possible. And yet, social tensions were not erased by the war, and even though when the war began, patriotism boosted by propaganda permitted a large national unity and a real loyalty to the state. As the war went on, though, social and political tensions came back. Here's an example. As soon as 1915, there were strikes of workers in Britain demanding pay rise, but also rent strikes. That is to say that tenants refused to pay their rents because the price of housing had increased a lot in British cities due to the necessity of having more workers living in cities next to the factories. And so the demands of the strikers were often satisfied because the government could not afford a decrease of production. So in fact, World War I was an interesting moment for the history of social relations between workers and government and between workers and management. As you can see on this graph, throughout the war, strikes remained, and more frequent in Britain than in any other country. We already saw that when we studied the fact that the urban working class was more numerous and more active in Britain. It was also very active in Germany. And even though the year 1915 and 1916 probably showed the lowest levels of strikes of the recent period, you can see how much, by the end of the war, the number of strikes boomed, which was a response to the worsening of living and working conditions as the war effort was sustained. So 1917 really marked the peak of these tensions. We already talked in other lessons about the mutinies among French soldiers in 1917. We also mentioned the fact that strikes in Russia, which triggered the revolution, well, they started as hunger strike for most of them, as you can see on this picture of demonstrators, which are mostly women, while many men were at the front, and whose slogans were "Feed the children of the defenders of the homeland," or "Raise the ration of the families of the defenders to liberty and national peace." In 1917, you would find strikes in all countries at war. In particular, in France, where they were rather new, they did not have, they had not happened before in the war. There was this famous strike of May 1917 of textile workers, known as midinettes in French common language during the war, which were demanding a pay rise and the possibility of having their Saturday afternoons off. In fact, they wanted the same rules as existed in British factories at the time. In Italy as well, violent strikes were cracked down in blood. And you understand that the context of 1917 was in favor of this multiplication of strikes. The news of the revolution in Russia started a kind of wave of rebellion all over the rest of Europe. There was a real wariness regarding the war effort, which had started in 1914, and in front of the real economic difficulties that civilian population were facing. We may note that there were also some tensions linked to the feminization of some jobs, to the growing presence of women in factories, on docklands and arsenals, in tramways. And one of the problems was that women were paid half the men's wages. An income inequality that was not about to decrease immediately, unfortunately. As you know, there still are income inequalities between men and women. But during the war, women were met with the hostility of male workers, because male workers were worried about this competition of lower wages for women. And they were afraid that their jobs would lose their skills and lose their level of revenue due to that competition. From a general point of view, in fact, there was in society a suspicion against these women that were now working in factories, and it was believed that they would learn rebellious behaviors, immoral behaviors, and so the factory girls in France or in Britain were seen with suspicion during the war. But a question that may be surprising is that we may wonder if there were any positive changes in societies during the war. In fact, the improvements that happened during wars could be observed in many conflicts of world history. But in particular in these conflicts of the 20th century, where the worst things mankind and society can produce were often accompanied by some positive changes anyway. Well, I don't know if flamethrowers are positive changes, but this picture is here to illustrate the fact that war boosted not only industrial production, but also scientific innovations. And in engineering in particular, flamethrowers, but also tanks, planes, or submarines were improvements that later would be also transferred into improvement in civilian transport. We can also mention medicine, where huge improvements in surgery, notably transplantation, but also blood transfusion or the spreading of the use of antiseptics were things that would have, after the war, a really great impact on living conditions all over the world. And in fact, the impacts on the standards of living was not only negative for the civilians, in particular for the working class. In Britain in particular, wages rose and the poorest benefited from the greater intervention of the state in the economy. For the poor, rationing was not necessarily a bad thing. And for example, in Britain, during the war, the consumption of milk and eggs increased because rationing gave the possibility for the poorest to have access to these products. After the rent strikes that we mentioned a couple of minutes ago, rents were controlled in the British cities, and so for the British urban working class in particular, even if there were problems of liberty and of course all the anxiety linked to the war, well, technically speaking, economically and socially speaking, some improvements could be seen as well. And of course, one of the big issues of the social impacts of World War I is the question of the status and conditions of women. Was World War I a watershed, a turning point for the status of women? The answer is largely yes, but with some moderation. Yes, because women were given new professional opportunities, and they often earned better wages than before, or were given more professional responsibilities than the traditional jobs they had left. For example, many women left domestic service during World War I and never came back to domestic jobs. Here you can see on this picture some women who are being trained for being bus or tramway drivers in Germany. And something interesting for the British section is the fact that one of the great political impacts of World War I was to accelerate the acceptation by government of giving the right to vote to women. In fact, it was the case with this Representation of the People Act of 1918, which enlarged the right to vote to 9 million women and also 5 million additional men, as the voting age was reduced to 21 for men. And it could be seen as one of the secondary results of the long struggles of the suffragist and suffragette movements in favor of women's vote since the beginning of the century, and also linked to the fact that the suffragette had mostly offered cooperation to the government during the war. So this enlargement of franchise was presented by the government as a logical reward for the commitment of the nation in the war effort. In fact, you can understand that the communication chosen by the British government was that because the British society had acted with such courage and loyalty during the war, both on the front line and in the home front, then enlarging the right to vote as a reward was seen as something fair, a bit like a deal. And so it's illustrated here by this cartoon from Punch magazine showing a kind of Joan of Arc celebrating the victory of women regarding the right to vote. But there were limitations to the Representation of the People Act, and I will use it to talk about, in fact, all the limitations that we can observe on change for women. About the right to vote, it was only given to women over 30 years old, who were householders or wives of householders, occupiers of property of an annual value of not less than £5, or university graduates. So in fact, only to a large but an elite of women. And most of the female workers who had worked in munition factories, for example, did not get the right to vote at this moment. All women would have the right to vote only in 1928. Moreover, wages remained lower for women than for men throughout the war and after. And limits were put on their training because often men, and the trade unions defended that point, believed that it would be a problem if women became as skilled as men, notably in factories. After the war, many jobs taken by women disappeared. You have the example of munition factories. Okay, many of them closed or changed their production. Many jobs were also given back to men, in particular in the post-war context of increased unemployment. And so some figures show that in Britain, by 1919, almost 1 million women had been dismissed, and the women employment rate of the year 1921 was below the level of women employment of 1914. So it was kind of back to square one for women on the economic ground, even though this moment of World War I clearly accelerated directly in Britain their growing role in political affairs. In France, as you know, there was no equivalent because it would only be after World War II then the right to vote would be enlarged to women.